in terms of like remote coaching, it creates a massive limitation on the level of client I can actually coach, really, to an extent. It's because in general, most people that are active are the ones that are looking for coaching. And then I suppose they're the smaller group of people, whereas the ones that really need the help and the bigger group of people are the ones that aren't active. And if you assess them by doing a squat or stand up, sit down, stand up they might not even be able to do that, and it might be too much for them. So that's kind of what I'm finding at the moment and coming to realize.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, when people are, and I've heard so many stories about assessment processes where people are physically sick midway or at the end of the physical assessment process, or they were so sore, they couldn't walk, or they couldn't move their arms for a week. So not really a great introduction to exercise for somebody who is thinking, I want to do this for my health, right?
I think there's a bit of a challenge to challenge people to try and train their clients without making them sore. Like, that's probably going to be a hard challenge for some people, because it's so easy as a coach to keep giving more and more and more. I think it's harder to say, okay, you're going to do 5 squats today, and that's it. That's all you're going to do today, and trying to sell that.
Yep, we're just going to give you some stimulation today, get your nervous system and your orthopedic system and material system custom to this basic idea, and then we'll progress that, slowly over time. Especially for the crowd that one thinks or is using exercise as a caloric expenditure event, right? So when they're using it almost exclusively as a caloric expenditure event, then they're very frustrated, because if they're not working hard or sweating profusely, then they feel like it's a waste of their time. Even when they're injured, they just keep doing it.
I've got a client at the moment who's perimenopausal, and she's had some like history of just mental health struggles in terms of anxiety around food and nutrition, stuff like that. And has been more over the past month and a half or so, is experiencing the symptoms of menopause more and more and more. And I was like, okay, we're going to dial back your training. You're now doing 2 sessions a week. It's going to be very short, very relaxing, and just stimulating, I suppose is the best word to use. Mm-hmm. And then on the other days, you're just going to walk. You're going to go out for a nice 20 to 30 minute walk. That's it. Brisk pace, no getting out of breath, no thrashing yourself. And I had a call with them, and I called her and asked her about the walking. She's like, yeah, I've been running on the treadmill. Okay. And her reasoning was like, I put on weight and running will help me lose weight. I'm like, well, yes, in a simplified manner, but with the complications that you have in terms of the menopause, your weight is going to fluctuate on a month-to-month basis. We just can't avoid that. And running is potentially doing you more damage than good. And we've got another call to kind of discuss some of that next week. So yeah, as a coach, it's definitely been a bit of a challenge for me to go, okay, actually, I've just taken on a new client, and he went into the gym. He's like, I felt like I didn't do anything. I was like, perfect. It's exactly where I want you to be. He's got a new child. He's sleeping 5 hours a night. I was like, until you can sleep more than 5 hours a night, there's no point. Like adding volume for one. And he's been out of training for a couple of 6 months or so. So yeah, like going in, like his aim is to come out of the gym session feeling better than he did when he went in, and it shouldn't take him more than 30 to 40 minutes from start to finish. And he's like, is that really how little I need to do? I'm like, yep, that's exactly it. Well, 2-3 years time, you'll be doing more, but now this is where you need to be.
Yeah, I mean, exercise can easily become a stressor that produces cortisol responses, right? And I mean, the fight-flight response can be easily induced by a brutally intense exercise session, or again, even one that might not seem on the outset or observationally as super intense, but because of the person's internal hormonal chemical milieu of processes, that it's a stressor for them, and they might not lose any weight because of that alone.
Yep.
It's they might gain weight because of the stress.
Exactly. And this is what I'm trying to get this like the female to understand, and so that can be the case. So like the conservative approach, yes, it's going to take a little bit longer to kind of figure out what's going on, but until you're eating properly, until you've got control of your sleep and your anxiety, the exercise is most likely only going to add to that problem if it's too intense and there's too much of it. So finding that balance, and it's the whole mix up behind the intent of the usage of exercise, and the usage of exercise, so one as a calorie expenditure event, as you said, and for two as stress, its perception of stress relief because of the endorphin release afterwards. You're like, no, it's not a stress relief. Like, you might feel good afterwards because of the adrenaline and cortisol and all the other stuff, all the other endorphins that are floating around, but actually it's a massive assault on the body system. So trying to educate a client into understanding that after 30 odd years of, you must thrash yourself really hard and sweat to lose weight, because the calories come out in your sweat. That's the theory.
Yep, which it doesn't. It comes out as carbon dioxide, right? So calories of your sweat. It's so bizarre.
Every millimeter is a calorie of sweat.
So, yeah. Yep, all those wives' tales and misunderstandings. It's very, very difficult. Less is more.
Yeah, it's intriguing as to how people that know nothing about. So my mum, for instance, has decided she wants to lose some body weight and get healthy and get fit. Because if she doesn't, she's probably pre-diabetic now, arthritis in the knees. And I'm like, okay, get a coach. Like, you wouldn't be in this position if you knew what you were doing. And she's a dental nurse. And I was like, if I had a toothache, what would you tell me to do? She's like, maybe take some painkillers and go to the dentist. I was like, exactly. Take your own advice. But no, I want to try and do it on my own. I'm like, okay, but if it's not worked over the past 40 years, why do you expect to just suddenly have this knowledge around the most complex system that is known, that we know about? More complex than the universe is this thing that we're in. And it's crazy how people just think it's so simple. Eat less, do more. It's too simple. It's too simple to be. It's too easy to be that effective in my eyes. Most of the
time. It's a challenge. I mean, as a consumer, I understand the impulse for self-efficacy, right? We live in a do-it-yourself world, and how do I get this quickly? Why do I have to wait for anything? Expediency, right? Satisfaction, soon as possible. Save money, right? I don't want to spend any money I don't have to spend. I mean, isn't all exercise just exercise? Walking, running, walking my dog, that's all exercise. Why do I need structure around that, right?
Yeah, exactly. Why do I need someone to help me do that?
Yeah,
it's easy.
Right. It's easy. So, yeah, it's a tough problem for the consumer. It's again part of the commoditization of everything, really. The consumer wants everything to be a commodity, on something they pick off a shelf and just do when they want. Until when? Till they're sick, till they're diseased, till they're injured, till they have pain and other sensations they don't like. And now they're like, oh no, now what am I going to do?
I think it's because it's so easy to in that point, to see a tangible, or to get something for your money, you can have this tangible exchange. Whereas when there's nothing wrong and you give someone money, you're like, well, what am I paying for you? There's nothing wrong. You're not doing anything here because you're not getting anything tangible back. And it's like, you're not, yeah, it's like you give someone $5 and you get a can of Pepsi like back. That's how I imagine the consumer is seeing it. Where it's just, yeah, the body isn't like that. One of the things I wanted to talk about was this idea of inhibition. Basically, again, from this mentorship that I was on, the person who took it, when I was taking it, he briefly mentioned about going from this static state of inertia, as in we're not translating through space, to moving. So that instant where we start moving, or just before it, whatever it is, as a state of like inhibition, because our body is trying to it's trying to balance all the time, isn't it? This is kind of the explanation I gave. Body's trying to balance all the time. It's trying to stand up, and the brain's trying to figure that out. To start moving forward, we're essentially falling over. And then the idea behind the Grays thing is that our bones react. Our gravity acts on our bones, and then our muscles react to that. That makes sense. So bones move muscles, muscles don't move bones. That's what they're saying.
Wow.
Yeah. Which I personally, I can understand what they're saying. I can, because, and I think this is their rationale behind, okay, if you lay someone down and they're dead, and then you cut open their posterior thigh and you pull on one of the hamstrings, then the shin comes up towards their butt. You let it go, it goes down. Okay, the hamstring must flex to the knee. And they're saying that's not the case, because when the body is standing upright, it doesn't flex the knee because there's already stored energy in it. Like an elastic band, it loads to explode. So when you're stood up, there's energy in it. So as soon as you lift your leg up, the knee bends. That makes sense. In actual fact, using the hamstrings as an example, it decelerates hip flexion. This is what they're saying, their understanding of it.
Well, it's one of the things it can do.
Exactly.
But it can do lots of other things, right? So this gets back to body view, right? And understanding complex systems and mechanics and physics, right?
Yeah.
How do you go from a state of equilibrium to a disequilibrium? Yeah. Which is, I kind of think how I kind of asked you the question. Is that how you're thinking about that, right? Is that we're in a pseudo equilibrium, standing in a gravity field where muscle contraction is absolutely necessary, or you will be on the ground. So to say your muscles are contracting. So that's kind of what they're saying is, well, initially, if you're standing in a pseudo static way, you have a lot of muscle tension keeping you that way.
Yeah.
And then to change that state, you have to reduce muscle tension. So you go into disequilibrium, and then you catch yourself, right? And get into a new dynamic equilibrium state called forward ambulation, right? What motor theorists, I think, call an attractor state, where as you change states, we fall into a new equilibrium at a lower energy position. So, okay, I guess, but to say that the muscles have to be inhibited in order to go from standing to walking, I'm not sure that makes much sense to me.
I'm not sure, but I personally don't see that as the case. I see it as it's like you're voluntarily like plyometric on the posterior side, let's say, again, speaking very generally, as in the muscles are plyometric on the posterior side, on the anterior side they're myometric, and others, and it's a constant interplay and interchange of
yeah, I mean, the initiation of the change, right? The first change, I mean, you could probably use any number of the segments to change the inertial state of the body, going from zero velocity or zero momentum to some positive momentum value. Obviously, energy needed to go in there because there was an acceleration. So when you're at zero velocity to some new steady state velocity, the point in between zero and the steady state is acceleration. So that, that requires energy to go in.
Yeah.
Or an energy change. So whether or not someone is standing up and says, I'm going to relax my back muscles so my trunk starts to flex, which creates rotational inertia over my base of support, which is essentially me falling forward, and then I'm going to catch myself and start a new dynamic equilibrium process, versus me standing still and saying, I'm going to plantar flex my right ankle system to generate tension, to elevate me and again change my center of mass to over my base of support or outside of my base of support, so that now I'm moving, and then I'll just keep that going, right? So I think there's probably a number of ways that the system could change its equilibrium state to generate a new dynamic process. So, okay, but whether or not it's inhibition, I would argue that it's not inhibition in the sense that they're using that word, which is, right, let's relax muscles, and that's what's going to get us walking. Because if you were to stand up now and then think, I want to start walking, what do you do first?
Yep.
In terms of the choice of walking. And each of us might make unique decisions about how we're going to initiate ambulation. So be curious to see the research studies on that. I'll get an EMG. I've got an EMG. I'll put that on the calf muscle or whatever, the posterior calf, and see what happens. I'm going to, at some point, make a decision to start walking and see, what happens. Now, could you put an EMG on every possible muscle? No, probably not. So I don't know. I guess I don't. Why would that be important that we describe it as moving from a static standing position to forward ambulation is the result of inhibition, when it's probably the result of a combination of excitation and a coordinated or governed event of some things being excited, tension being developed, while other things being inhibited or less tension being developed, so that a change in state can occur.
Yeah. Because I understand the idea behind the muscles reacting to the movement of bones that are being manipulated by gravity, or not necessarily just the bones. I think there's an oversimplification of it. I think it's more just the body and your muscles reacting to the way the body is moving.
Muscles react to the bones. It's just, it seems so nonsensical to me.
I think I understand. So imagine if you've got guy wires on a pole that's standing upright, and the guy wires are the gravity is constantly trying to pull it over, and every time it moves, the guy wires. This is another analogy that you used, which is, analogy is always problematic, but every time the pole moves slightly, one guy wire takes the strain and kind of pulls it back, and it's a constant adjustment process. That's what they're saying is happening in the body when we're moving. It's reacting to force, reacting to the force of the floor. As our foot hits the floor, then our muscles start reacting.
How did your foot move at all to begin with?
Exactly. And this stored energy is what they're saying. It's like the elastic potential of the muscle.
Yeah, but how did the elastic energy get stored in it?
I imagine through electricity and yeah.
Oh, no, elastic energy stored by deformation, right? So the material has to be deformed along its lines of extension for energy to be stored in it, let alone released at some point.
Yeah.
So it's an excessive focus on one particular part of the process. Because in order for my foot to be off the ground, how did it get off the ground?
As in when you're walking, if we're using that as the example.
Yeah.
Yeah, like I suppose it's a voluntary process, isn't it? But the moment you you can create a muscle contraction.
You have to create a muscle contraction. Nothing will move, right? And so the only reason your foot's off the ground is because your hip flexed.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So a muscle contraction. So they're saying, okay, so your hip flexor muscles change your hip joint angle, which might change your knee joint angle, which then gets the foot out of contact from the ground. But now the foot and all the structures of the foot are just hanging there in a relaxed state, waiting until they come into contact with the ground, and then they react to the ground reaction force, right? But this is all driven by the intention of the system to stay upright. Because without the intention to stay upright, why would you stay upright? And that's an active process.
So I suppose circling back to this idea of inhibition, do you even think that there is such a thing in the body as inhibition?
It is, but it's an active process. It's not a passive process.
Because I think that's where the confusion is. Most people would assume that inhibition is passive.
Yeah, they're mixing. It's the use of the term inhibition. In a previous organization I was involved in, this term was thrown around all the time: muscle inhibition, right? Reciprocal inhibition, reciprocal innervation, excitation, and I realized that it's primarily just being used intransitively, and that we're just talking about some hindrance. Something's being hindered versus something being passive. So it's not the same thing in the human nervous system where neurotransmitters are coming across synaptic clefts from certain presynaptic axons or dendrites, and they're transferring a certain neurotransmitter substance to the next neuron, the postsynaptic cleft, and those neurotransmitters might actually repolarize a motor unit so that it doesn't send efferent information to tell anything to contract. Those neurotransmitters are actually maintaining the polarity of the cell so that it doesn't produce an electrical signal. That's active. That's an active chemical electrical process, so that the body has a mechanism for saying, I don't want that to contract so much, or I don't want spike volleys or more motor units recruited, right? Or firing frequencies to go up. I want them to go down. And so the neurotransmitters do that. Some of them are excitatory. and they tell motor neurons to depolarize and increase spike volleys or recruit more motor units so that more tension is developed. So again, that idea is superficial and parochial, dude. It doesn't really make sense when you start to try to dismantle it and go, wait, what are you saying now is happening? The muscles only react to changes in joint angle that are based on external forces acting on the joint system, and then moving the joint angle, and the joint angle change is then what triggers the muscles to contract.
That's what we're saying.
Wow, dude.
I think it's the action reaction law taken a bit too far, and
yeah, it's like, wait a second. Yeah, wait a second, right? Yeah, there are times when the myometric part is critical for whatever it is you want to do. There are times when the plyometric part is critical for what you're trying to do, and they're constantly working together, and that at zero velocity, we call that an isometric, and that's critical that you reach an isometric point. That's the only way you can change directions. There has to be a point of zero velocity, but it doesn't mean no contraction.
Yep.
It's just a very uninformed.
I think it's very much the Gray Institute.
Oh, I'm aware of that. Yeah.
It's I think it informs like that idea, and some of those ideas. Again, I'm paraphrasing and probably missing a lot out, but it informs their whole process in terms of the way they think about loading a muscle and fixing movement, again in quote marks.
It's a great example of how body view informs methodology, right? And why philosophy matters. I mean, so you would never pick up a dumbbell if you were going to train your elbow flexors under this methodology. You would never pick it up and start the movement with a myometric, right? You would always start the movement with the elbow flexed and go into a plyometric and then go into a myometric. Is that what they say? Is that how they train everything?
I literally, I think, well, I can't remember, it was a while ago, but I think I remember asking pretty much that question. And the answer was, well, no, because of obviously the weight of the distal end of the elbow flexor, so the forearm, that is what's essentially loading the muscle. When you're stretched out, it's loaded. The muscle is loaded there. So the biceps, when my arm's extended, is loaded. So I then increase the load by taking hold of an external weight, and then also you have to create contractile force to get it back up again. This is like that. My confusion was then, okay, well, you've only loaded it with X amount of tension on the way down. When as soon as I add more load to it at the bottom, I can't then overcome that power, like without contracting my bicep at a higher rate, if that makes sense.
Yeah, again, it's assuming a certain set of conditions that may or may not exist. You could set up conditions. I can set up a condition where your elbow flexors are not contracting. Give you a dumbbell, and you're not starting from a loaded, lengthened position. You're starting from a relaxed, lengthened position, position of relative length. And your first action, right, to generate tension, the work of that is myometric.
Yeah.
I can set that up. And so what's the problem with that? It might be a very important motor skill to go from a relaxed state to a myometric.
Because there's always going to be some form of tension within the muscle, isn't there?
It has to. Anyway, you don't.
Unless you're dead, when the electrical signal's dropping, even then there's still tension.
Yeah, that's why we did that exercise of defining contraction modes or modes of the muscle system or the motor control modes. Well, how do you define isometric when there's no tension? How do you define isometric when there's co-contracted tension? How do you define an isometric when there's no co-contraction, right? And these are all different ways of the system being in terms of governance over the joint angles and the relative linear distances between muscle attachments. That's how that goes. And so you have choices all along that continuum, luckily, right? So they're saying in order to even move, you have to create elastic storage of energy. You have to create a plyometric first to even start moving.
Yeah.
So that's why they describe it, because they have to fit it into that body view, that view of how the motor system works.
Yeah.
Versus saying, no, why don't we start from an isometric position and initiate a myometric, and then we can start this cycle of myometric, plyometric, isometric, myometric, plyometric, isometric to generate a new effector state. Okay. But to say that all motion must be initiated via a plyometric first and the storage of elastic energy is nonsensical. And then to say all exercise has to be built and executed that way is nonsensical.
Again, it drives.
Because how do you get out of a chair?
Exactly.
And do a plyometric first?
Yeah. Well, there would be a plyometric state somewhere in the system, wouldn't there? There'd be a plyometric contraction going on, or a lengthening state. So if you're sitting in a chair, I have to lean forwards. Like if I'm sitting bolt upright, there's not many people that can just stand straight up from that position. You have to create a hip hinge to create some momentum, to create
but that's a myometric.
See, on the anterior side,
yeah,
in most cases.
Yeah.
On the posterior side, there'd be a
lengthening, yeah.
Muscles, wouldn't there?
You can't do one without the other.
Yeah,
the question is, who's controlling the joint change? Both together, one by itself, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. That doesn't make any sense to me. So.
That's the thing. Obviously, if I'm using the elbow flexor as an example, when I flex my elbow, I'm creating a myometric contraction from my bicep, but there's a plyometric contraction going on my triceps.
Now whether there's tension in the muscle or not, you're not sure about that. I could set it up. You could, what a co-contraction is, right?
Yeah.
Right, where you make a muscle, tighten up all the voluntary tension, isometric around, and then you start to change the joint angle while maintaining tension. Well, now I have a co-contraction on both sides, the lengthening and the shortening, but you can set up a scenario where there's no tension on the other side of the joint, and you're just developing tension on the myometric side. It's not always necessary that you're managing some co-contracted state. It's not necessary all the time.
This is what I'm thinking again, just not to argue the point, but to discuss it, debate it, I suppose. Obviously, if I'm, again, elbow flexion as an example, I flex my elbow. Because of the attachment and the insertion, there's now load in the tricep region, whether that's
There's no load. There's no torque against that.
Doesn't there have to be? Because I'm now flexing my elbow. There's because it's moving it's lengthening the muscle away from the insertion. It's taking the...
Yeah, the two attachments are getting separated, right? But that doesn't mean that the muscle has to be contracting for that to happen.
Okay, so it's literally just lengthening.
That's it. So that's why we call that a voluntary passive plyometric. That's why we put all those modifiers on the contraction modes. Involuntary, voluntary, passive, active, conscious, unconscious. Like, what is the state of the nervous system during this action.
So you're defining a plyometric, using that as an example, as a state of lengthening whilst trying to contract towards the center.
Nope. That's one possible mode. But the other mode is just simply the joint angle's changing and the attachments are getting farther apart. They're separating.
That'd be a passive.
Yeah. So we defined plyometrics by joint angle change and linear distance change between attachments.
Yeah.
And then we attached, okay, what's the nervous system doing with the muscle? So
that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, so take a look at those definitions again.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense.
If I grab your wrist and move your elbow and you're relaxed, now what's happening? You're not contracting at all, but your joint's moving and your attachments are getting shorter or separating or approximating on both sides, depending on which way I'm going, but without muscle tension. So that's still a myometric and a plyometric, but now without any contraction.
Yeah.
We would call that a passive. That's what passive motion is.
I think that is, again, I'd have to ask the question in the other group that I'm in just to see what their side of it is. Oh, I forgot what I was going to say now. I lost my train of thought. No, it's gone. Yeah, I'd have to ask the question of like, if they've thought of that, if they considered the passive and active overlay of or they call it the eccentric and concentric part of an isometric.
Yeah.
If they considered overlaying active and passive, and then thinking about contraction types, and then passive and active, and because again, or
voluntary or involuntary.
Yeah. Because the way they would, let's say, so for me, potential slight scoliosis. I don't know. I've never had an X-ray to see. No, my left side doesn't work too well. I can't control it too well. Their idea was to load it by taking the origin away from the insertion, and that would get it stronger. Whereas your idea is, well, part of your idea is to actually take it closer to increase my voluntary control of the area.
I would do both. Yeah, I would do both.
And theirs is purely involuntary, active plyometric state. They're not really.
That means there's a torque. So we define that as there's a torque that is actively changing the joint angle and changing the linear distance between the attachments in a way that you as a subject, the owner of the system, cannot stop. You may be able to slow it down, but you cannot terminate the change in length and joint angle. That's an involuntary active plyometric. What would be called negatives.
Yeah.
Right? That's not the same thing as me voluntarily lengthening tissue or changing joint angles, but being able to stop anywhere I wanted. That's not the same. That's not the same process, not the same governing strategy. It's not the same material stress, none of it. They're not the same.
Again, this is where body view comes into it, doesn't it? Because it takes a lot off. It's one of the first things you said to me is like I asked the question, why do you use the table? And you were like, well, we're not taking anything off the table. We're using it. If it's a tool, why would you not use it if it's effective? And they are very against touch, as in physically, manually touching someone, unless you've essentially got a license to do so, which again, I can understand, but again, you limit yourself and by doing that.
Well, think how crazy that whole idea is. I mean, so you don't have a license to physically touch someone or cue them, but you sure have the ability to put 400 pounds on their spine and make them back squat, right? As if somehow that's safer then just, it's so ridiculous. It really is. It's maddening, right?
I suppose it informs their use of what they call functional drivers to drive motion.
Yeah, that's
Want
like,
it to be voluntary, and because I do recall us having a discussion about like involuntary action. Is like if you're trying to fix a motor pattern, they're saying, or you can utilize a strength of another, the systematicity idea, the strength of another motor pattern to help fix the weaker one. Which again, I see their idea. I just think it's being utilized in an effective manner. Is that right by saying that? Because we talked about how when you pick up a cup and you go to take a drink out of it, you don't think about contracting the bicep, internally rotating the radius and ulnar using the.
Think about the gross macro task.
Yeah. And we've had this discussion about how voluntary active contractile potential and control seems to carry over to involuntary gross motor pattern.
Yes, that's what's interesting about that. The better you get at voluntariness, the better you get at involuntariness.
Does that carry over the other way round? Because that, I suppose that's their thinking, is it carries over, and that actually equals more force production, because they don't really focus on. They do, because they still utilize bicep curls and all that sort of stuff.
Right? Yeah, they do. Right.
It's just, I think it's just they've not thought about it. Maybe, I don't know.
They haven't. Yeah, it's not they haven't thought about it too deeply at all, unfortunately. But that's okay. That happens.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, so a driver, right? So if I can't, bring my right elbow into flexion from this configuration under these conditions, and I want to use some other part of my bodily system as a driver to help support elbow flexion, what would I do? Trunk extension?
Exactly.
Is that how they think about it?
Yeah, a very oversimplified view, yeah. So, for instance, the hip's always a good one to use to explain it. So imagine someone squatting down, and a better one. Imagine someone lunges and they seem to completely avoid utilizing and kind of sitting into their glute. Let's say their left sagittal lunge, so lunging forwards, and they just don't really use their left glute and their left hamstring, what they would deem as can't get in to the muscle. What would they would then potentially do is that, okay, the sagittal motion is the safest motion, is what they're saying.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah, this is it.
It's just crazy.
It's like, I think in comparison to where like the frontal and the transverse planes,
the safest one. It's just ridiculous. That's the kind of stuff that just drives you nuts, man.
So what they would say is, okay, we're going to utilize the strength of the sagittal plane, which you're in, and then we're going to drive the weakness. So what they would do is, okay, the weakness is that you're not moving frontally through the hips and through that area. So what we're going to do is we're going to drive that by, let's say you're lunging forwards with your left leg, we're going to have a left hand overhead, right overhead lateral driver in the frontal plane. And that would create a state where your hip has to go that way to an extent. Like if you just can't go all the way into that, you might reduce it back down again and so on.
Yeah. Okay. I don't know.
Because I've seen,
not from a reaction force perspective. That's just the person wants to stay in the lunge configuration under the base of support scenario that's been created by that. And so when they move their center of mass of their trunk to the right, in order to stay over your base of support, you have to move something to the left. But that has nothing to do with creating an internal plyometric loading scenario that contracts the muscle. It's just wild.
I think it's overcomplicating in potentially the wrong direction.
Yeah.
Because then, like, you start seeing hands going all over the place. Okay, we're going to drive the frontal plane, which is the weakness, and we're going to incorporate the transverse plane. But I get it in terms of, okay, if you're able to do that in creating movement variability, and okay, we want to be able to move in as many scenarios as possible in 4D space. Yeah, start utilizing all these hand drivers and reaches and things like that, so you're able to control those positions. You have some semblance of knowledge about what to do, or your body does what to do when you kind of get into similar circumstances. And like, one of the guys in the group works at a football club, I won't name which one, a soccer club, big club in the country, and they're talking about ACL assessments and utilizing a transverse lunge, so 135-degree lunge, as a better assessment of an ACL or potential ACL tear possibility. That makes sense. So in footballers, okay, what's a good assessment? Because it's a big discussion point in soccer, because it's, if you tear an ACL, you're out for a while and you might never come back. So they're trying to protect against it. It sounds like, okay, if someone exhibits a real poor movement capacity in a 135-degree transverse lunge, that is a better assessment than sitting on a bed and someone sitting on your foot with a knee at 90 degrees and then just pulling on your tibia to see what the joint laxity and thing is. So.
Well, again, when you start saying better than, unless you know the actual tensile load capability of the ACL, I know that's the reason the orthopedists do the passive test, right? Supposedly is to get the muscle co-contraction out of the system, so that they can just get a sense of how much resistance there is in their hands. It's like a muscle test in a sense, a ligament test, to say, well, how much motion is in the joint when there's no muscle tension on it, and when does the ligament reach its full extensibility before it tearing, right? And so they get a sense of how much give there is. Give just, again, being the displacement they're either visually seeing or feeling tactily when they do that drawer test, right? Okay, but they still don't know the absolute tension that any ACL is capable of producing before it tears. They don't know. There's no way to measure it directly. What's the most important thing that's going to protect the ACL from going through an excursion that exceeds its tensile yield stress limit?
Supporting structures.
Their muscle contraction control.
Yeah.
And the rate of rise of that and the absolute limit of that for any number of conditions. So, yeah. I don't know, dude. That kind of stuff's pretty wild.
Yeah. So I know you have been through a similar path, or been down a similar path. But what kind of brought you back from that? Was it similar stuff that I'm talking about now?
Yes. When you start, you're hearing the words and the language, you're like, wait a minute, as I understood the material science better and how the nervous system works, and I'm like, wait a minute. The words aren't even right.
Yeah.
And you cannot measure any of it directly. None of it.
We think we can.
You, that's the, that's the problem.
Yeah.
We're imposing certainty on situations where you don't have it.
Yeah.
And you won't know until you exceed a material yield stress limit until it's exceeded.
Yeah.
then you'll know.
So again, that's where zooming out, worldview, body view, and philosophy
matters. It matters.
Yeah.
It matters.
Maybe that should be a topic you talk about.
That probably should be the topic. Yep, that could be the topic.
That's the book, The Philosophy of Fitness.
The Philosophy of Exercise.
Let's trademark that.
Yeah, and I've struggled with that because I'd like to have examples like we're talking about now, like, okay, here's a philosophical body view, and here's how it plays out in methodology, and what its limits are, and what its constraints are. Okay. I'm not saying it's good or bad. It's just, this is the limits. This is what it won't look at anything else because this is how it sees everything. It won't even consider anything else because this is how it sees everything.
Yeah.
And then it makes massive assumptions about the efficacy of its own philosophy, right, and methodology. Because we load first and then explode, and we train everybody to load first and explode, that means their system's more robust, more injury resistant, right, and more right. I don't know about that. Not sure about that. I mean, you want to talk about material stress. What puts the most stress on materials? Rapid lengthening, rapid deformation, especially near the end of its molecular covalent ionic bond structures, right? That's when stuff tears and breaks.
Yeah. Covalent bonds. That's a flashback to like is that chemistry? Covalent bonds.
I mean, what do you think's holding the thing together, right? It's these bonds. That's what's holding these materials together. Ultimately,
it's a huge flashback. I haven't thought about those for a while.
Well, that's why I ask people, what do you think you're changing about the cell? About the material.
This informs your massage and stretching, and there's the other one that I'm kind of dealing with at the moment in terms of someone wants to get more flexible. So, okay, from our perspective, I don't think I've reconciled, okay, how do I do that without stretching? And again, I'm thinking of like the eccentric contract or the plyometric contractions, utilizing those, like that's pretty well developed in the research now to increase muscle length or the control at length. If that makes sense.
Yeah, the control at length versus we're going to change the material length of the tendon, collagen, muscle complex. Maybe. You could add proteins, you could add sarcomeres. That's been shown.
But to do that at any level, that's going to take an inordinate amount of time.
Long time.
An inordinate amount of time. And most of the research around stretching is, in terms of the reasons against it, is based on time. So it takes too long to develop extra sarcomeres in series of the muscle to create extra length on the muscle, so it doesn't work. So stretching doesn't work.
Yeah, it's a long time.
No, it just takes a long time to do
regular, daily, repeated, long duration stressors along lines of remodeling the tissue so that there will be subtle molecular changes to cell relationships. So, okay, but yeah, the material side, it takes a long time to change some of these materials, if they'll change at all.
Exactly. Do you think that's I suppose, a fool's errand to say, okay, we're going to try and increase the length of your muscle, because by the time that actually happens, to the extent that you say might need, let's say you want to be able to do the splits, and all you can do at the moment is move your feet slightly wider than shoulder width apart. The amount of time it's potentially going to take you to get there
assuming you have the synovial joint structure to do it,
and assuming that the muscle isn't already long enough. In that scenario, that someone does have the joint makeup to be able to do it, but the muscle is just not long enough. Like, in that case, like, is it worth the effort to try and to lengthen that?
That's what you got to decide. I mean, this is decision-making science now, right? Like, what do we want to spend our time doing?
And what is the problem? What is the real problem?
What are we really trying to do here, right? So, yeah.
One client I've just taken on says, okay, I get back pain, and it's because my hamstrings are tight.
Right, it's crazy.
Because when he stretches his hamstrings, the back pain goes away momentarily. It's a temporary thing. He's like, okay, I need to stretch my hamstrings. I was like, okay, do you need to stretch your hamstrings, or do you want the back pain gone? I suppose that's the question. That's where the psychology comes into it. What is the actual problem?
Absolutely. Listen, I got to get going, man.
Yeah, no worries. Great talk.
Did you get a chance to read that paper on?
I have, yes. Lex economy stuff is that's tough for me. It's a world I've never dove into, so I need to read it more.
All right, yeah. Let me know if you got any questions about that.
Will do, yeah.
All right,
sure.
See you, man.
Have a good day.